On the forgotten edge of the West, in a patch of land that never made it onto any map, there lived a man. He never visited the town. No one ever visited him. His name was Elias, but even he couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken it aloud. Every morning, he fixed the same fence, poured the same bitter coffee into the same cracked cup, and listened to the same wind creeping through the same old crack in the wall. Time passed here without sound, only dust spoke. And the dust always whispered the same thing: no one is coming. Until one morning, a shadow appeared near the far end of the land. And for the first time in 20 years, Elias felt something. Figures walking, slowly, deliberately, their clothes catching the wind like ghosts from the edge of memory. He counted them as they came closer. 8 women, silent, but moving straight toward his land. They sat up tense without a word. Not one voice was raised. Yet something in their eyes struck him, a familiarity buried in strangers' faces. And that's when he realized these women knew who was. This story unfolds like an echo rising out of silence. But first, I have a small request. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop your answer in the comments, because sometimes where you enter a story changes how it ends. If you enjoy slow, deep, and mysterious tales of the Wild West, please consider giving this video a like. And if you're new here, subscribe. There are many more dusty secrets waiting on this road. They say the wind has a voice out here, not a loud one, not something that shouts, but soft, like a breath through an old coat sleeve, dragging along the dry ribs of a forgotten fence. And if you sit still long enough, you can almost hear it murmur a name, though most of those names have long been buried with the bones they once belonged to. This is where Elias lived, not in a town, not in any place with neighbors, roads, or even direction. He lived past the last signpost anyone remembered, past the cattle trails that dried up after the war, past even memory itself. He wasn't always silent, of course. There was a time when his voice filled rooms, when his laugh echoed under saloon rafters, when he'd shout over the pounding hooves of horses and call his son in for supper. But silence, like rust, doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in slow and patient until one day you wake up and realize you haven't spoken aloud in years. Elias's days were not marked by clocks or calendars. They passed in the repetition of small rituals, nailing down the same loose plank on the fence that would always come loose again, scraping black beans from the bottom of the same pot, wiping the same dust off the same table, only to watch it settle again minutes later. Every morning, he would stand on his porch, boots sunk deep into gray dust, and look out at nothing in particular. The plains didn't offer much to look at, only emptiness, like a canvas no one dared to paint on. The sun rose, the sun fell, and in between, time moved like molasses down a cold tin cup, slow, sticky, and unwilling. There were no visitors, no letters. The mailbox was more of a habit than a hope. He still checked it, though, every morning, opened a creaking door, stared at the emptiness, then closed it again. Not disappointed, just accustomed. Inside the house, things hadn't changed in decades. The same crooked shelf above the fireplace, the same oil lamp that hadn't been lit in years, the same rocking chair worn down to a soft curve by weight. And time, and of course the same photograph on the mantel, a woman and a boy, their faces slightly faded, as if the past itself was gently retreating from the frame. Elias never dusted that photo. He let the wind do it. Every so often, a gust would sneak through the cracks in the wall and blow just hard enough to make the glass shine again for a moment. He didn't expect anything anymore, not redemption, not conversation, certainly not visitors. He existed, like a stone half buried in the earth, like a fence post with no wire left to hold. And in that stillness, that endless, aching stillness, he had found something that felt almost like peace, almost. They say hope doesn't die all at once, it fades. like the ink on a letter that's been left too long in the sun. Every morning, Elias walked the same worn path from his porch to the mailbox, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust that shimmered like ghosts in the rising light. The mailbox itself was crooked, leaning just slightly to the left, as if too tired to stand tall anymore. The paint had peeled long ago, leaving behind only the scars of weather and time. The hinges creaked with the kind of slowness that didn't. Protest only accepted. Elias would open the little rusted door, stare inside for a long moment, then close it again without a word. There was never anything there, not in years, not since the last letter. That one he remembered. Not just the message, but the weight of it in his hands, the way the paper had trembled slightly in the breeze, as if even it were unsure it should have come. 17 years. That's how long it had been since ink had bled across paper with his name on it. The letter had been short. 5 lines, maybe 6, but each word had fallen heavy, like nails into wood. And after reading it twice, then a third time just to be certain, Elias had folded it once, exactly in the middle, and placed it into a cracked cigar box under his bed. He never opened it again, but he remembered every word. Still, he came to the mailbox each day, not out of expectation. Not really, more out of rhythm. Like brushing dust from the windowsill, or tightening the same piece of wire on the fence. These were not tasks born of purpose, they were rituals, meant only to hold time in place. He never told himself he was waiting. He never said aloud that he wished for anything. But some mornings, when the wind carried a certain chill, or the sky wore that faded shade of blue that reminded him of her dress, he lingered a little longer at the mailbox, as if the empty space inside could suddenly change. As if the past might find the courage to send something forward. Once, long ago, he had written back, just one letter, folded neatly, sealed with wax, and walked half a mile to the post office that had since been boarded shut. He placed it in the outgoing box, and walked away. It never came back. He never knew if it was read. But sometimes at night, when sleep held him in a half-waking dream, he imagined a fire somewhere far away, and a woman holding a page close to her chest, reading his words like a prayer. There were no new letters after that. No more words written or received, only dust. And dust, Elias knew, didn't write much. But still, every morning, he opened the mailbox. And still, it was empty. It was a morning like any other, the same pale light stretching over the hills, the same dry wind curling through the brittle grass, the same silence pressing against the wooden walls of the house like a weight that had grown familiar. Elias sat on his porch, hands wrapped around a tin cup that no longer held heat, eyes lost somewhere beyond the horizon. He didn't expect anything, and that was exactly when it happened. A flicker. Just a flicker at first, out past the far fence line, that uneven border of old barbed wire and leaning posts that marked the end of what was his and the beginning of what wasn't. He squinted, leaned forward slightly, unsure if it had been real or a trick of tired eyes. But then it moved again. A shape, no, two rising slowly through the wavering curtain of heat and dust. Then more. Shadows stretching toward him, slow and distant, but steady. Not riders, no horses. Just people. Walking. Elias stood, the chair beneath him groaning like it too didn't want change. He set the cup down and stepped to the edge of the porch, one hand resting on a support beam that still bore the scratch marks from a firewood rack he had taken down 10 years ago. The figures kept coming, not fast, not loud, not threatening, but coming nonetheless. He watched them for what felt like hours, though only minutes passed. 8, he finally counted. 8 silhouettes moving together, like a string of paper dolls caught in a breeze. They were too far to see clearly, but something about them, the way they walked, close and sure, the way they seemed to know where they were going, unsettled the silence inside him. Not fear, not yet, but a stirring, as if something long buried, had begun to shift. Elias turned and walked inside, closed the door softly behind him. Not out of rudeness, not out of caution, but because he didn't know what else to do. He stood in his kitchen, eyes on the window, heart doing something it hadn't done in a long time, whispering a question he couldn't quite form. Who were they? Why now? What did they want? But perhaps the deeper question was this: why did it matter to him at all? The silence he had lived in for so long had been more than absence, it had been shelter. And now something was approaching that might disturb it. Outside, the dust lifted under the feet of strangers. And inside, Elias's quiet began to crack. They arrived without a sound, no shouted greetings, no rattling wagons, no questions carried on the wind. Just 8 women, each moving with quiet purpose, their boots pressing softly into the dry earth of Elias's land. They did not knock on his door. They did not call out. They simply began to set up camp near the old fence line, as if this place had already been chosen long before their journey began. Elias watched from the shadow of his house, one hand resting gently on the edge of the window, his breath held without realizing. The women moved like they'd done this before, not here, maybe, but somewhere. There was rhythm in the way they unpacked canvas and rope, in how they raised tents with movements practiced, deliberate, patient. None of them looked hurried. None looked afraid. They didn't speak to one another, at least not in words he could hear. And yet, they were not strangers to each other, that much was clear. There was something shared in their glances, something silent that passed between them like a lantern passed from hand to hand in the dark. Elias could have walked out. He could have demanded answers, or at least introductions. But something about their stillness, their quiet confidence, made him hesitate. These were not intruders, not quite. And yet, they were not guests either. They were something in between. One of the women, tall with a red scarf tied around her wrist, paused and looked up toward the house. Her eyes met his through the dusty window. She didn't smile, didn't wave. But in that single glance, Elias felt as if every word he hadn't spoken in 2 decades had suddenly been heard. He stepped back from the window, heart pacing like a horse startled by thunder. Inside, the silence grew louder, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that fills a room when something unspoken has just walked in. The women lit no fires that night. They gathered in a circle outside their tents and simply sat, facing one another, hands resting calmly on their knees. Elias watched until the light faded completely. Not once did they look toward the house again. Not once did they call his name. And yet, somehow he felt as if they knew it. All 8 of them knew him, knew why he lived here, knew what he'd lost, and knew, perhaps, what he had forgotten. That night, Elias did not sleep. He lay in bed listening not for noise, but for silence. And it came. But it was no longer his alone. The night fell like a slow breath, heavy and long, covering the plains in a soft hush where even the coyotes seemed reluctant to speak. Elias sat by the window, his silhouette barely outlined by the dim flicker of an oil lamp he hadn't lit in years, but now watched like it might remember how. The women remained outside, still gathered in that strange, wordless circle, as if holding counsel with the stars. A wind moved through the dry grass, gentle but persistent, lifting small clouds of dust that shimmered in the moonlight like forgotten thoughts. Then it came, not loud, not sharp, but clear as glass being placed carefully on wood. A single word, carried across the night air with no force, yet it struck Elias like thunder. Elias. He didn't move at first. It was as if the sound had split time in half before and after. The name echoed in his chest more than in his ears. He hadn't heard it in 20 years, not once, not from a mouth, not even from his own lips. He had let it erode, piece by piece, until it became just another stone on the path, something to step around, but never pick up. And now, here it was spoken by a stranger who had no reason to know it. His knees grew weak, and he sat down slowly, as if the weight of that one word had added years to his bones. He stared out into the dark, but could not tell which woman had said it. They all remained still, heads bowed, hands resting quietly on their laps. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of recognition, of something sacred that had been unearthed without permission. Elias felt a tremor in his hands, not from fear, but from some other feeling he couldn't name. A feeling older than grief, deeper than loneliness. It was as if someone had reached into the soil of his past and pulled out the one root he thought was dead. He whispered it to himself, unsure if his voice would still work. Elias. It felt strange in his mouth. Familiar, but distant, like a tune half remembered from childhood. The sound didn't comfort him. It unsettled him. Because now he could no longer pretend to be no one. Someone had named him. Someone had found him in the dark, and that changed everything. He sat there for a long time, the name still ringing. Somewhere in the space between silence and sleep. Outside, the women did not speak again, but they didn't need to. They had already said the only thing that mattered. That night, the fire rose slowly, not in a blaze, but like a memory unfolding in orange and ember. The women built it with quiet hands, gathering driftwood and broken branches from the nearby mesquite, placing them in a careful circle as if they'd done it 1,000 times before. Elias didn't approach. He stood beneath the slanted roof of his porch, arms crossed over his chest, watching from a distance where warmth did not quite reach, but the flicker of light still found his eyes. The flame danced low at first, licking the wood gently before growing tall enough to throw long shadows across the dust. The women sat around it, legs folded, faces turned inward, eyes half closed like they were listening to something no one else could hear. They did not speak, not in the way most do, but their lips moved softly, slowly in a rhythm that didn't need sound to be understood. It wasn't language, not exactly. It was closer to breath, to feeling, to something ancestral that lived between syllables and silence. The wind shifted, carrying their murmurings toward Elias. He couldn't make out the words, if they were words at all, but something about the cadence struck a chord so deep it made his knees lock. It reminded him of hymns, of his mother's voice in a tiny church that smelled of pine and candle wax, of lullabies his wife once sang, barely audible over the crackle of winter fires. The sound stirred the air around him, curling beneath the old wooden doorframes, and into the spaces of the house he no longer entered. He closed his eyes, let it wash over him. He didn't want to understand. He only wanted to remember what it felt like to be near something human. The firelight made the women glow in hues of copper and rust, their shadows long and swaying across the earth like threads from a forgotten loom. One woman extended her hand toward the flame, fingers open, as if offering something unseen. Another leaned forward, touched the ground, and whispered something into the dirt. Elias stepped back, heart thudding like hooves against dry clay. He wasn't afraid, not of them, but of the ache beginning to swell inside him, a longing with no name, no shape. A door he had nailed shut long ago, now creaking open. The murmurs rose and fell with the wind, like a tide he could not stop. And in them, he felt the edges of his past soft, frayed, and unbearably near. The morning came with no ceremony, just a slow unraveling of darkness into pale gold. The kind of light that didn't wake the world so much as reveal it, softly, as though it had always been there beneath the night. Elias stood near the porch. Again, his shadow long and bent across the brittle grass, hands tucked into the worn pockets of a coat that hadn't been washed in years, but still smelled faintly of cedar. The fire had died down, leaving behind only the warm glow of ash and a few curling whispers of smoke. The women moved quietly as always, but this time there was a shift not in what they did, but in what they saw. One of them, a woman with gray in her hair and a line of blue beads around her neck, looked up at Elias, not as a stranger would, but as someone who knew how he took his coffee, how he folded his shirts, how he once laughed in the rain. Their eyes met, and without raising her voice, without even standing, she said a name. Not Elias, not this time, a different name. One he hadn't heard spoken aloud since the day he buried it deep in the dry soil behind the house, where wildflowers once bloomed before they gave up. The sound of it cracked through him like lightning through rotted timber. He staggered slightly, gripped the porch rail, heart thudding not with fear but recognition. That name had belonged to someone else. Someone he had once been, briefly, before the world had changed its shape and asked him to forget. But he hadn't. Not truly. You can't bury the past in soil that remembers rain. The woman looked away after she said it, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just unearthed the one truth he had spent years pretending was fiction. The others didn't react, or if they did, it was inward, subtle, stitched into the stillness between breaths. Elias stood frozen, the name still echoing inside his ribs like a trapped bird. His mind reached for details he had trained himself. To forget a name on a certificate, a cry in a wooden crib, a night spent digging with trembling hands, and no one to ask why. These women, they weren't strangers, not entirely. They carried pieces of something he'd helped build, and then run from. Their silence wasn't unfamiliar. It was inherited, shared, bound to him by something deeper than memory blood, maybe. Or the kind of promise made without words. That morning, Elias didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. But the air around him changed, thickened with truth. And beneath his boots, the earth felt softer, as if the things he'd buried were stirring again, not to accuse, but to return. The morning broke with its usual stillness, the kind that didn't announce itself, but simply replaced the dark inch by inch, casting pale light over canvas and stone. But something felt different, not in the air, nor the sky, but in the silence itself. Elias sensed it before he counted, before he stepped outside with his usual half-interest, before he even sipped his lukewarm coffee. One tent sat oddly still, its flaps unmoved by the wind, the traces around it too clean. The woman who had once occupied it, the one who had stood nearest the fire, who hummed softly when the others were quiet, was gone. No footprints, no disturbed earth, not even a ripple in the dust to show the direction she'd taken. Elias scanned the open field, eyes narrowing, but there was no sign of her, as if the land had swallowed her in the night without a sound or struggle. The others didn't speak of it. They moved as they always did, quietly, deliberately, without alarm. Their calm unsettled him. It wasn't indifference. It was understanding. As though they had expected this, or at least accepted it. Unable to resist, Elias walked slowly toward the empty tent. His boots pressed into the dry soil with unfamiliar weight, each step breaking 2 decades of practice distance. He hesitated at the entrance, then lifted the flap. The inside smelled faintly of rosemary and sun-bleached fabric. A blanket still folded neatly, a small metal cup half full, and resting atop a worn leather bag, yellowed at the corners, and cracked along the seams, was something that did not belong to her, something that very much belonged to him. A letter, Elias's letter, folded the same way he remembered folding it, tucked into an envelope bearing his trembling script. A letter he had written 17 years ago and sent into the world without hope of reply. The paper was soft with age, the edges curled like petals in drought, but the ink still held. He picked it up with both hands, as if afraid it might disintegrate. The moment he touched it, memory flooded back the night he wrote it, the words he couldn't quite finish, the hope he dared not name. Why she had it, how she had found it, these questions screamed quietly within him, but he did not ask them. Instead, he sat on the dirt floor of the tent and read his own voice from the past. Word by word, line by line, until the dust blurred the page and the wind stopped moving outside. She was gone, yes, but she had left something behind. Not just the letter, not just a mystery. She had left a crack in the wall he had built around himself, and through that crack, the truth had slipped in like morning light. The sun rose slowly that morning, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet offering, a golden hush that settled across the land like a warm hand on a weary shoulder. Elias stood by the old well, its stones weathered and flaked with lichen, the wooden frame above it gray and splintered from years of sun and neglect. He had not touched it in over a decade. The rope had frayed, the pulley rusted to near silence, and the bucket, cracked and crooked, had long since stopped holding anything worth pulling up. It had become, like so many things on this land, more symbol than tool. Yet something pulled him toward it that morning, a whisper inside that said, "Try." One of the women approached without a word, her footsteps soft, measured. She carried nothing in her hands but brought presence with her, the kind that made space feel fuller, not heavier. Elias glanced at her, then back at the well. He wrapped the rope around his hand and pulled, expecting resistance or worse, nothing. But the pulley creaked to life with a reluctant groan, and the bucket descended, twisting gently as it sank into the darkness below. The woman watched, her eyes steady, her silence calm. When Elias began to pull the rope back up, she stepped forward without asking and placed her hands beside his. Together, they lifted. The weight felt honest, earthy. When the bucket emerged, it was dripping, not empty, not full, but enough. Enough to say, life still stirred below the surface. The other women came slowly, one by one, each with a tin cup or worn basin. They didn't crowd, didn't speak, but formed a soft rhythm, drawing, pouring, passing. Elias found himself in motion with them, part of something without needing to define it. The silence remained, but it was no longer a wall. It had shifted into something gentler, a shared breath, a mutual respect forged not through talk, but through doing. His hands moved alongside theirs, rough palms brushing linen sleeves, fingers thick with callus wrapping the same handle another had just held. There was a kind of music in it, not of instruments, but of intention, a harmony of small acts. When the sun rose higher and the sweat gathered at Elias's brow, he looked around at the circle of women, at the bucket, at the well that had given again after so many years of drought, and felt something he hadn't known he missed, the weight of community, not loud, not demanding, just present. And in that presence he felt himself return not all at once, but piece by piece, drawn up from the deep like water, from a well that had never truly been dry, only waiting. They left the same way they had arrived, without warning, without words, and without stirring the stillness more than necessary. One morning, just before the light fully broke over the edge of the horizon, Elias stepped out onto the porch and felt it in his bones before he saw it with his eyes. They were gone. The tents were gone. The footprints were faded. The scent of campfire smoke had already been swept away by the wind. Only the well remained, half full and quietly glinting in. The golden light, and the earth around it darker now, richer as if it remembered the weight of shared hands. Elias did not call out. He didn't run down the slope or search the horizon. He simply stood there, the brim of his hat casting a long shadow over his weathered face, and listened. Not for their voices, but for something far quieter. Something within, and there it was. His name, whispered not by the wind this time, not carried on the breath of someone else, but rising gently from inside his own chest like a slow ember catching flame. Elias, soft, certain, his voice. Not cracked or unsure, not rehearsed or strained, just real. He spoke it again, quietly, to no one but himself. And the sound of it, his own name, said in his own voice, felt like a door opening where a wall used to be. The house behind him no longer felt empty. The silence no longer echoed. It listened. It held things. The rocking chair creaked not from disuse, but from the memory of bodies that had sat near it. The photograph on the mantel seemed clearer now, like the dust had retreated of its own accord. In the days that followed, Elias still walked to still checked the mailbox. Still mended fences that would break again. But there was rhythm now, not habit. Purpose, however small. Sometimes he would speak aloud not to fill the silence, but to answer it. And though the land remained wide and the road untouched, he no longer felt like the last man on the edge of a forgotten world. The women had gone, yes, but they had left him something that lingered longer than footsteps' presence, remembered without effort. Some mornings, he would pause in the doorway, stare across the vast open land, and imagine a flicker of movement beyond the fence line. He wouldn't wait for it, wouldn't wish for it, but he would nod to it, just in case. Because now, when the wind stirred, it didn't carry the cold of loneliness. It carried a voice, his own. And for the first time in 20 years, that was enough.